Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2. Hopefully, you've become somewhat acclimated to the course and familiarize yourself with the syllabus and the assignments that will be due this term. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. If you feel like the questions would be relevant to the entire class, please post it on the questions and answers board that's located in the orientation module. That way, everybody can receive the information. In week 2, chapter 2, we're going to be talking about various theories of drug use and abuse. One of the things that we discussed last week was the implications on substance use via trauma. So that's what we're going to be looking at right now. So when we define trauma, so this can be a difficult feat because cross-culturally, throughout the world and throughout person to person, trauma can look very different. What I deem as a trauma, you very well may not, and vice versa. But how we've defined trauma here is an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. So it doesn't necessarily matter if somebody externally views a experience as traumatic. If the individual themselves views it as traumatic, that's when we deem it trauma, if that makes sense. And the key is that it has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in regards to mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Okay. Different types of trauma. So of course we may think of the typical abuse and neglect. So physical, sexual, emotional, verbal abuse, physical and emotional neglect. I want to be careful about this one because we don't necessarily always categorize emotional neglect as trauma. And so I want to define that a little bit. Not being taught by our caregivers how to tolerate stress appropriately or how to emotionally regulate is a form of emotional neglect. I know that more often than not, emotional neglect is not something that is malicious or done on purpose. Okay, I think that there are a lot of societal implications here. For instance, there is nowhere in this country that you can make minimum wage and support a household on your own. And then you have kids on top of that. It's not going to work. So also the idea that we can have a parent in the household, typically both parents, if it's not a single parent household, both parents have to work, right? So that we're seeing less and less of live-in caregivers, okay? And so both of those things, as well as having to send our children to daycare, which is called secondary caretakers, have, full daycares, multiple children. We look at the classrooms, we look at teachers as secondary caretakers. They're taking care of 25, 30 kids at a time. So many children aren't getting their emotional needs met, okay? And so what I mean by emotional regulation, this could look like a child being told that their way of emoting is inappropriate. You shouldn't be angry right now. You shouldn't be sad about this. Stop crying. Or we just get angry and say they have behavioral problems when they're acting out, right? Instead of being able to share space with them and be present with them and teach them how to appropriately process anger and process emotions, a lot of times they're just told their emotions are wrong and they shouldn't behave that way, but they're not actually taught the skills to deal with them, okay? Also, toleration of stress. Children are going to be stressed out. We're stressed out as adults. And I think that we live in a culture that's very fast-paced and says, oh, we'll just throw a pill at it, or oh, we'll just drink about it. I think that's the norm here, rather than finding healthy, productive ways to manage stress. So that encompasses emotional neglect. Also historical or collective trauma. So this is trauma that happens to peoples as a whole. So we can look at slavery, the genocide that takes place in indigenous communities, and the Holocaust. Those are examples of historical or collective trauma. Also, experiencing or witnessing domestic violence in the home or community violence. Experiencing adversity in childhood, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. Living during wartime or being in the military, right? Fighting in wars, being a refugee. Racism, institutional abuse. So this might look like abuse experienced in incarceration or abuse experienced from external institutions like hospitals or mental health programs. It happens. Systemic oppression, which I think in this day and age we're all pretty familiar with. So this is folks that are marginalized within our society. Okay. Scarcity. So I think this is a pretty universal trauma that many of us experience. So scarcity is just this feeling of not having enough. Okay, so not having enough time, not having enough money, not having enough friends. It doesn't matter what we don't have enough of. Just that scarcity, that fear of not having something or not having something is a trauma. We can also experience vicarious trauma. So that's when we are in relationships with folks who have experienced trauma. So this might be a partner, a friend, a patient, or a client, somebody that we work with. Okay. Natural disaster, toxic and prolonged stress, which I think many of us can also relate to. So this might be experienced when we have to work 2 jobs to take care of our children, or go to school full-time and work full-time. And of course, grief and loss. So loss of a relationship, loss of a job, loss of a loved one. And there are many other things that we could add to this list, but I think this is a pretty good start. I like to talk about trauma and addiction using this acronym called N.E.A.R. This was developed by a Washingtonian named Laura Porter at UW. And N.E.A.R stands for neurobiology, epigenetics, adverse childhood experiences, and resiliency factors. So we're going to go into each one of those now. I apologize for my deep breathing. If you watched my intro video, I am about almost 9 months pregnant, so it's getting a little bit hard to breathe because she's sitting on my diaphragm. So I do apologize for that. So also this slide is a little wonky, but that's okay. So there's a couple major parts of the brain that I want to discuss. And this is just basic neurobiology, so don't get freaked out. The prefrontal cortex, so that is this space of the brain. It's responsible for what we call higher executive functioning. It's what makes us allegedly superior to other species on the planet. And I say allegedly because I don't know that we're really that superior all the time, but we have the highest type of functioning of all the species on the planet. Meaning our ability to emotionally regulate, our emotional intelligence, our ability to plan, our ability to think critically, all of that lives here. Okay, it is also the slowest part. It's the slower part of the brain, which will make sense here in a second. And it goes offline when our threat system is active. Okay, so what I mean by that is when our fight, flight, or freeze, or any kind of function of our threat system, which we'll go into in a minute, is turned on, it emits certain brain waves that reduce the functioning of the prefrontal cortex by about 80%. Okay, and we want that to happen. The reason why we want that to happen is because essentially that threat system is only meant to be on when our life is being threatened, when we're in danger. That's actually not the case. It turns on frequently for many of us. But evolutionarily, that's what its purpose is. And so we don't want this higher functioning, slow part of the brain turned on when our life is in jeopardy. So it's supposed to be turned off in that space. Now, it's the environment that's abnormal, which we'll talk about in a second. So the amygdala is where that threat system is. Some of us call this the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. It also helps us consider whether an experience is rewarding or aversive. So it kind of tells us how to store the memory. Like if this was a traumatic or dangerous situation, we are going to store it differently than if it was just normal daily life, right? Because we want it to be in the forefront because, again, the purpose of that part of the brain is to keep us alive. This threat system is hyperactive in folks who have experienced trauma, especially folks who have experienced trauma during the developmental stages of life. So what I mean by that is when the brain is forming. So 0 to 5 being the most crucial time, 0 to 14 also being crucial, and then 0 to mid-20s, mid to late 20s is also when that brain is developing. We used to think that the brain stops developing later for biological males, earlier for biological females. That's not true. I mean, most of the development does cease, but the brain changes and grows and builds new synaptic pathways, which we'll talk about what that is a little bit later in the class, until the day we die, assuming that we don't have some type of like severe neurological disorder, okay? The other part of the brain that we're going to discuss is called the reward circuit, or the HPA axis. This part of the brain is, so this and the amygdala, the threat system, are the oldest parts of the brain. So I want to say that they're the oldest and strongest parts of the brain. This prefrontal cortex is relatively new. And how that happened was when we found fire and were able to cook our food, it broke down the cell walls in the food, thus giving us different types of nutrients, ending with a bigger brain, including that prefrontal cortex. But when we first evolved, the amygdala and the reward circuit, that primal or reptilian brain was what we had. The reward circuit's purpose, again, is to also keep us alive. This part of the brain says that sex, nourishment, food and water, winning, and safety are pleasurable. The reason why evolution, whoever, wanted us to feel pleasure is because we need those things in order to survive. Especially when we think about living out in tribes. We needed to be able to win, essentially, to win against elements, to win against other tribes, wild animals, that kind of thing. So that competitiveness is actually ingrained within us. Something else that we'll jump into, I think, here in a few minutes is the fact that the amygdala is also where primary dopamine production occurs. This is really important because this is what makes an addict, if you will, or a person with addiction, excuse me, is if that amygdala, so that part of the brain that's responsible for threat and the production of dopamine, is constantly using its energy to assess and manage threat, right? Because we've experienced developmental trauma, dopamine production is going to be affected. It's going to be stunted, okay? And so for those of us with substance use disorders, we start at a baseline level of dopamine that is lower than folks who have not experienced developmental trauma. And so I'm sure maybe you or somebody that you know who uses substances has said before, I just do it to feel normal. They very well might not be lying, okay? And of course, there's more to it than that. But we tend to have lower levels of dopamine at baseline. And if you're unfamiliar with dopamine, that is what we call the pleasure neurochemical, or the pleasure neurotransmitter, responsible for rewarding experiences, euphoria, pleasure. Okay, we'll look more at that. But firstly, what we need to talk about is attachment. So that prefrontal cortex that we were talking about, that part of the brain that's responsible for our higher human complex functioning, is wired by attachment. So what I mean by that is wired by nurturing. From birth to age 5, a child's brain develops more than any point of life. And more than 90% of that prefrontal cortex is wired by attachment experiences. So if this is stunted because of abuse and neglect or societal implications that we talked about earlier, person is going to be affected throughout the lifespan. Okay? So this picture really beautifully shows what attachment is. So babies don't know what they need. As newborn infants, they don't know what they need. They just know that they're uncomfortable or they're unsafe. Okay? They cry, they get nurtured by their caregiver, and that trust develops. That relationship with its caregivers is going to shape the way that this brain is wired, and it's going to shape the way that we have relationships and how we perceive the world throughout our lifespan. Okay? So, the quality of those experiences, whether they be positive or negative, are going to shape how our personality is formed, all of the most important parts of being human. So what we see in healthy, or what we call secure attachment versus insecure attachment, is the following. So when somebody has that healthy, secure attachment, we are a whole lot less likely to see substance use disorders, mental health disorders, depression, anxiety. We tend to see stronger self-esteem, more independence, successful social relationships across the lifespan, and trusting relationships with the caregiver in the world. Okay. Whereas in insecure attachment, we tend to see the opposite. We see distrust of the environment and folks, other people, impulsiveness, unstable personalities, negative or maladaptive emotional regulation, more likely to be involved in risky behaviors, whatever that looks like. And there is a undeniable link, I think that, in fact, I think they only come exclusively between insecure attachment and oppositional defiance disorder, conduct disorder, and PTSD. So we talked a lot about this already, but the functioning of this fight, flight, or freeze, or this threat system, is the amygdala, or that threat system, senses danger, and it has to make a split-second decision on how to stay alive. Now, danger when we evolved way back when, and danger now looks very different. Fun fact, this part of the brain is only supposed to be hyperactive for 3% of our lives. I don't think that's really the case for anybody I've ever talked to. I've read some research recently that said more so on average, we spend about 70% of our lives with that threat system turned on. And there's some things that happen in the body when that system is functioning. And so one of them is this release of hormones and chemicals from these glands above our kidneys called the adrenal glands. And they release adrenaline, cortisol, catecholamines, and epinephrine, among some other things that we're not going to talk about. And so what that looks like And again, the amygdala is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It perceives a threat and prepares the body for the threat. Okay. However, modern threats here now, poverty, social isolation, things that were not threatening to folks living in tribes many, many years ago. Okay. So our threat system is now turned on, even though our life isn't directly in danger. Okay. So that's the issue here. And there's nothing wrong with us. We're not broken. The world's wonky. Anyway, eventually I feel like we'll evolve and our bodies will be better able to stand this level of threat, as sad as that is. But for now, we're not. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But something that I want to share, again, is this functioning that happens in the body. So these neurochemicals are released, these hormones and chemicals are released. Cortisol, if you've ever gone on a diet or seen a nutrition, you probably talk about cortisol. So the function of this is to store fat differently. Cortisol kicks in because we need to save our energy. We need to store that fat at a much higher rate so that we can run, fight, do whatever we gotta do, right? The epinephrine and adrenaline increases our heart rate, our blood pressure, our breathing, okay? That's why when we have anxiety or we're threatened, we get a racing heart, we might start shaking or sweating, getting nausea, right? We also release adrenaline, which if you've ever seen somebody do something like pick up a car or do something that looks superhuman, if you will, that's adrenaline, okay? Not good for the body all the time. Like I said, this is only supposed to be the case for 3% of our lives, which is likely not true for anyone. We talked about how the amygdala turns off the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. This trauma and toxic stress that leads that part of the brain to be turned on frequently can lead to an overactive fear and anxiety circuit. Okay, so we tend to become hypersensitive, hyper aware of the environment, rightfully so, because we need to be on guard. That's what the brain thinks. And it's hard for us to relax, hard for us to calm down, hard for us to inhibit fear. Okay. And what that means is stress, chronic stress just leads to more stress. We're more likely to be stressed out the more that we experience stress, if that makes sense, because the body becomes used to that. And so the body's like, you know what? This person's always in danger or in perceived danger, perceived threat. Therefore, let's just keep this turned on all the time to keep that person alive. That doesn't work very well for our lifespan. So we talked about the reward pathway, and you're welcome to come back to this slide if you'd like. The dopamine discrepancy, so we talked about this. So just to reiterate, dopamine is also produced in the amygdala when the threat system is constantly active. Dopamine production is stunted. Therefore, we are more likely to engage in activities and habits that are highly dopaminergic just to get to that like normal level, such as substance use, unhealthy eating, processed food hits that button very similarly to how drugs do. Okay, I think I saw a research study once that like compared the effects on the brain from like cheese and crack. It wasn't very different. Of course, the way that we perceive those two things is very different. Engaging in high-risk activities such as gambling, risky sexual behavior, that kind of thing. So epigenetics, we're not going to spend too much time here, but just a kind of a basic overview. Epigenetics says that for sure up to 4 generations back and 4 generations ahead are going to be affected by our lifestyle and by our experiences. Indigenous populations have known this forever. Okay. They have known that what our ancestors had experienced is going to be passed on to us. Now we have science that proves that. So environmental exposures, levels of stress, diet, and lifestyle induce genetic changes and determine whether certain genes that leave us predisposed to certain things like obesity, coronary artery disease, substance use disorders, eating disorders, mental health disorders, whether those predispositions are going to be turned on or off. Okay. There's been multiple studies done on this. A couple that come to mind is during World War II, the Nazis blocked the food supply to the Netherlands, and there was a starvation period of about 1 year, I think. The babies that were conceived during that time had very high rates of coronary artery disease, mental health disorders, substance use disorders, as well as some other medical risks. Which made sense because they were starving. The mothers were starving when they were in utero, right? Well, those babies had the same high risk factors, okay? So they took a look at that. And then an epigenetic study had been done on rats where they exposed rats to the scent of a lotus flower and then shocked them. When those rats had babies, they had never been shocked, but when they were exposed to the scent of a lotus flower, they had the same stress response as their parents. And so forth. Their babies also had the same stress response. So this has been looked at in regards to the Holocaust, slavery. There's actually a really good book on this. I think it's by a Portland native. Her name is Joy DeGruy, and it's called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. So if this topic interests you, check that out. We're also looking at adverse childhood experiences. So in the 90s, there was a study done by Kaiser and the CDC in which 17,000 people were surveyed and asked the following 10 questions. Did you experience physical, emotional, or sexual abuse in childhood? Did you experience physical or emotional neglect? Or did a parent or caretaker have a severe and persistent mental illness or a substance use disorder? Did you lose a parent due to death, incarceration, or divorce? And did you witness domestic violence? They also did a medical workup on each one of these folks and determined what they had and what they were at risk for. And they found the following. They found a dose-response relationship between adversities in childhood and these things. So what that means is the more adversities that somebody had experienced, the more likely they were to be obese, have diabetes, suffer from depression, have STDs. They also saw an earlier initiation of sex and smoking, more likely to have a substance use disorder, more likely to have heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, to break bones, to miss work, to be unemployed, as well as many, many other things. Okay. And keep in mind, so the people that were surveyed are Kaiser insured folks in the 90s. So we're talking about primarily white, middle class, educated folks. Almost 75% of them had experienced at least one adversity in childhood. Almost half experienced 2 or more, and about 13% experienced 4 or more. This study has been recreated in communities of color, communities of poverty, and these numbers increase 2 or 3-fold. Okay, so times those percentages by 3. So about 45% of folks in those communities, including the LGBTQ community, LGBTQ plus, excuse me, they're more likely to have experienced 4 or more. About 50% of folks in those populations experience 4 or more adversities in childhood. Also, what we found was somebody who has experienced 4 or more ACEs has about a 500% increased risk of having an alcohol use disorder. And somebody who has experienced 4 or more has a 4,600% greater risk of becoming an IV drug user in their lifetime. Okay, so they're 46 times more likely. A couple other facts found from this study is folks who have experienced 4 or more adversities are about 5,000% at greater risk for attempting suicide across the lifespan. And somebody who has experienced 4 or more adversities in childhood is likely to die about 20 years earlier than other folks who haven't experienced adversities in childhood. And again, that's because of the hormonal soup that's going on in the body, the stress on the brain. If you've experienced 4 or more ACEs, I think that it's certainly something to consider, but this doesn't have to be our story. Okay, we can learn to reduce levels of stress and recover. Okay, so that does not have to be the case. The meaning behind this photo is just to show adversities in childhood lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which lead to adoption of health risk behaviors. This is how these ACEs work, right? Which lead to disease, disability, and social problems, ending in early death, like we just talked about. But when we talk about historical trauma and collective trauma sprinkled on top, we have whole other rungs here that go into this. Okay, so those folks are even more at risk. Resiliency factors, so how we come back from this. The top 2 are always going to be purpose and connection. Connection to the community, connection to the world, connection to others, purpose, a meaningful life, reason to get up in the morning, a reason to keep going, a reason to recover, a reason to find appropriate coping skills. Okay. Making space and opportunity for self-reflection. This could look like going to therapy. This could look like meditation, getting involved spiritually or religiously, and being of service to others, having a symbiotic relationship with the planet, with our communities. Okay. So some of the things that I want folks to remember from this N.E.A.R science is that when the threat system is turned off, or turned on, our higher functioning is turned off. Our experiences and our relationships in early life are going to affect the way that we interact with the world until we die. The reward pathway can be hijacked or taken over by substances and other dopaminergic experiences. Okay. A person's environment and experience with the world can alter gene expression for multiple generations moving forward, leaving them predisposed. Adversities in childhood and historical trauma are linked to disrupted neurodevelopment, social and cognitive impairment, and increased health risk behaviors, including disease and early death. Lastly, cultivating resilience is crucial in those who have experienced trauma and toxic stress. So, we know that trauma is the largest risk factor for substance use or process abuse. Some other things we can look at, people are searching for pleasure and trying to avoid pain. Makes sense. Trying to relieve tension, stress, or symptoms related to mental health, negative mental health, Peer pressure to enhance connection with the world or religious or mystical experiences, to enhance social experiences, maybe lower social anxiety, to enhance performance, and then again, relieve pain. Overall, substance use in the US has been increasing, continues to increase. I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. And I think that there is some, I know that there is a connection between trauma, scarcity, and these levels of use. Okay. Especially among younger folks and older folks. So folks that we would consider elderly are starting to use more, and then younger folks are also starting to use more illicit substances. Some other factors that contribute to increased drug use, accessibility being one of them. We'll talk a lot about the war on drugs next week and how the US has tried to curb supply. It doesn't work. People are going to find drugs and pay for drugs no matter how much they cost, and somebody's always going to come in and take over the supply. There's also greater availability about substances, right? So we can hop online, we can figure out how to take hallucinogens, what that feels like. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Also, you can buy drugs online. The potency of substances has changed, leaving them leaving us much more prone to become dependent or addicted. Some other factors that might influence, the effects of drug use: gender, size, if we're mixing the substances with something else, fatigue or illness, an empty stomach, and then our mindset. So believe it or not, many substances, the experience that we have with substances are altered by set and setting. So who we're with, what we're doing, where we are, hallucinogens especially, which we'll talk more about later on in the class. We talked a little bit about this last week. In total, looking at the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, we spend about $90 to $185 billion, your tax money, on criminalizing and treating substance use. We'll look more at that next week. So in defining addiction, I'm sure you've heard of all of the following. It's a bad habit. People just choose to do it. It's a failure of morality. People are weak. Could be a symptom of other problems, which is certainly true. And a chronic and debilitating disease. So the National Institute of Drug Abuse defines addiction as a chronic, relapsing brain disease that is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use, despite harmful consequences. It is considered a brain disease because drugs change the brain. They change its structure and how it works. These brain changes can be long-lasting and can lead to the harmful behavior seen in people who abuse drugs. There's a lot of controversy around addiction being a disease. And I think that the most intelligent conversation around it is, is the brain diseased or is it disordered? So we talked about trauma and its implications and how that would potentially lead to addiction. I think calling it a disease has a lot of benefits, right? So it had the medical community look at it differently. It started involving the medical community and involving treatment and involving doctors in recovery, which is great. The downfall, I think, from what I've experienced and worked with, is that the concept of it being a disease kind of takes the power out of individual recovery, right? Like I don't have much control over a disease. And I think that's part of the issue. And what we know, and if you're a person in recovery, you certainly know this, there is no medication. There is no like quick fix cure. You have to do the work. And that work can look very different from person to person. But I think sometimes the word disease can cause folks to think that they don't have control over recovery, or that it doesn't take a lot of behavioral modification and intrinsic work, which it does. And we'll talk more about that throughout the class. I'd love to have conversations with folks about it. However, the major models of addiction are the choice moral model, the characterological model, and the disease model. We've talked about the disease model, and we're going to go into each of these models of addiction right now. But something I want to bring up is that addiction literally means enslaved by or bound to. I will use the term addiction a lot in this class, but I prefer to use substance abuse or misuse or chemical dependency, a person with a substance use disorder, a person who is addicted to fill in the blank. I just don't, it makes sense, right? Like if you've ever been a substance user, you know that sometimes it can feel like you're held hostage by or enslaved by a substance. But again, I think language has a big impact, and so not the biggest fan of that word. Anyway, so I'm sure you've met folks who say addiction's a choice. People choose to do that. They assume that it's voluntary. I completely disagree, and again, we can have conversations about this if necessary. But what goes into choice and making decisions, based on what we know about neurobiology and how the brain is wired and the brain is formed, this has been debunked. Okay. It also says that we do technically decide whether or not to engage in certain behaviors. But when we think about that neurobiology piece that we were just talking about, some of us don't have all of that bandwidth or brain capacity to make an informed decision to begin with. And then if you sprinkle in living in a community where substance use or violence or whatever is common, we don't know what we don't know. So if we don't have a mentor that says, no, actually go this way in life, we're not going to know that there's a difference. The characterological model, this starts to make a little bit more sense. It's argued that some folks have an addictive personality, poor impulse control, low self-esteem. I think this fits into what we talk about, that biology, that neurobiology of addiction. But I don't think this paints an accurate picture of everybody who abuses substances. Disease model, the most widely accepted model, which we've touched on before, a belief that addiction is both chronic and progressive, and that the user does not have control over the use and abuse over a drug. I don't necessarily agree that we don't have control either. I think that at some points in our experience, we can feel like we don't have control, but based on what I know about recovery, I think that we can take back that control. And I think that the way that we're doing it isn't working treatment-wise for a lot of the treatment that we use. And I don't think that the treatments work for everybody. There's a really amazing video this week in the optional section called The Interpersonal Neurobiology of Addiction. that really addresses that control over use and abuse and kind of how to recover from it. One of the things that he talks about is involving the whole family in recovery. It might just be one person using substances in the family system, but this is a family problem, not an individual problem. Also, it's a community and societal problem, okay? And so understanding that and looking at it from that lens can be really helpful and effective. Diagnosing substance use disorders. So we won't spend too much time here, but I do want folks to know that the following are involved, and this will actually be on a quiz, so I need you to study up on this in your book. In order to diagnose somebody with a substance use disorder, the following will occur: craving, social impairment, okay, so it's getting in the way of work, school, home, relationships. Risky use might look like drinking and driving, intravenous drug use, smoking under the influence, or driving under the influence of marijuana, going to work under the influence, okay. Tolerance, so needing more to get the same desired effect. Withdrawal. And just a fun fact, we can also withdraw from processes too. It doesn't necessarily have to be substances, although the process withdrawal is not deadly, okay? Or not all substance withdrawal is either. We'll talk more about that later. Excessive time and energy spent on obtaining the drug or partaking in the activity, recovering from its effects, using the drug, okay? Use despite negative consequences and inability to stop or cut down. Like, I know that this is not helpful or healthful for me, but I can't stop. So 2 to 3 of those symptoms would indicate a mild substance use disorder. Typically, we might utilize prevention strategies or outpatient treatment for that, but more often than not, you're going to see moderate to severe substance use disorders. In moderates, you'll see 4 to 5 of those symptoms present, and then in severe, you'll see 6 or more present. We also have what's called qualifiers that we add to the end, and we'll look at this a little bit more later. We have early remission, sustained remission, maintenance therapy, or in a controlled environment. So, for example, you would have opioid use disorder in early remission if they've been clean for 3 months or more. Okay, I think it's 3 to 12 months is early remission. Above 12 months would be opioid use disorder in sustained remission. If they're on Suboxone or methadone maintenance therapy, you would say opioid use disorder on maintenance therapy. And if they're incarcerated or in a treatment program, you would add the in a controlled environment qualifier. Just a couple things. So historically, we have siloed mental health and substance use disorders. There's actually a legislation in Washington says that we can't do that anymore, but treatment programs are still doing it because there's really no board or anybody to keep programs accountable yet. And the reason why we separated them isn't because science says that they're different. In fact, it says the opposite. It's because of funding. Some funders wanted to fund money into mental health, but not substance use disorders, and vice versa, as well as many other money things. But keep in mind, these systems shouldn't be siloed because they both, behavioral health disorders are the same in a lot of ways, and they should be treated similarly, which we'll talk more about later. Drugs that are abused can cause mental conditions that mimic major psychiatric illness. So somebody who is specializing or focused on mental health really needs to have a firm understanding of substance use and vice versa, because they so commonly happen together. They're co-occurring. Most behavioral health disorders are co-occurring. So more often than not, you're going to see somebody who's depressed and using alcohol, or bipolar have bipolar disorder and an anxiety disorder. Typically, people aren't diagnosed with just one thing. We talked about the genetic explanation, so we're not going to spend any time here. I know that this video is getting really long and I want to end it here. But I just want folks to really look at this in the book, the social influence theories and the structural influence. We spent some time talking about this earlier. So social influence theories would focus on our interpersonal relationships and our communities, and how they implicate substance use or misuse. And then we also talk about structural influence, so the macro systems, is how society implicates substance use. We're not going to spend too much time here. I'm just going to skip this. The pattern of addiction. People aren't always going to follow this way, but more often than not, you will see it this way, where we experiment, or start using for whatever reason. This might be to escape, to numb from pain, for peer connection, and then we increase our use. We think that the drug use makes our life better, fits our lives well, and then we start to have problems and it starts interfering with our lives. Then we try to stop or try to change, and then we actually do change. Back when I started going to treatment a long time ago, they used to say, only one of you will be successful out of the 50 or whatever. Please don't tell people that. That's awful. Also, more often than not, people do recover. It might take a while, it might take a couple times, but more people stop using than continue. Some key terms that I'd like you to look at throughout the chapter and be familiar with are binge use, comorbidity, control theory, dopamine, habituation, neurotransmitters, subculture theory, and psychoanalysis. And here are some more resources if you'd like to look into that N.E.A.R science. Thank you all for hanging in there. I know this was a long video. Typically they won't be this long, I think. And I will see you next week.